Deep in the scorched heart of the Oklahoma Panhandle, where the horizon stretches like a taut wire across the plains, the earth hides secrets that refuse to stay buried. We often think of cults as distant nightmares, stories of Jonestown or Waco that happen to other people in other places. But in the summer of 1983, a darkness took root in the quiet, dust-choked isolation of Beaver County that would shatter the sanity of a community and leave a scar on the American soul. This is not just a story about religious fervor gone wrong. It is a terrifying autopsy of how quickly the human mind can fracture under the weight of fear and charismatic manipulation. We are about to descend into the stifling heat of Dead Man's Gulch, a place where a man named Gideon Blackwood promised salvation but delivered a furnace. You will witness the slow, agonizing dismantling of 19 lives, stripped of their free will, their food, and finally, their breath. This is the untold chronicle of the sanctified shepherd's flock, a journey that begins with a promise of heaven and ends in a locked barn with the smell of kerosene and the sound of a Zippo lighter flicking open in the dark. Prepare yourself. What you are about to hear is a true descent into the anatomy of a massacre, reconstructed from the ashes of the past. The summer of 1983 in the Oklahoma Panhandle was not merely a season, it was an act of hostility by the earth itself. By mid-June, the soil had cracked open like an unhealed wound, and the heat rose in shimmering, distortion-heavy waves off the asphalt of State Highway 3. It was a suffocating, blistering heat that frayed tempers and dried out the lungs, creating a psychological pressure cooker for the isolated communities scattered across the high plains. In this crucible of dust and desperate faith, Gideon Blackwood found the perfect temperature to forge his nightmare. To understand the massacre that would eventually stain the headlines of the nation, one must first understand the migration that preceded it, a slow, deliberate exodus that went largely ignored by a world distracted by the Cold War and economic shifting. Gideon Blackwood was not a man who commanded attention through volume, but through a terrifying, quiet intensity. He was a gaunt figure, often dressed in suits that seemed a decade out of date, with eyes that observers later described as voids where empathy should have resided. He had spent the early spring preaching in rented community halls and dusty basements across Beaver County, speaking not of love or redemption, but of fire. His doctrine was a complex tapestry of Old Testament wrath and survivalist paranoia, stitched together with his own prophetic delusions. He called his movement the Sanctified Shepherd's Flock, a name that sounded benign enough to the casual observer, but held a darker implication for those who listened closely to his sermons. Sheep are raised to be shorn, and eventually slaughtered. On the morning of July 4th, while the rest of the country prepared for fireworks and celebration, the residents of the small town of Turpin witnessed a disturbing spectacle. A convoy of 12 vehicles, rusted station wagons, overloaded pickup trucks and a single ominous black van lined up on Main Street. They were laden with supplies, bags of grain, construction tools, barrels of water, and oddly high fences of chicken wire. There was no joy in this departure, no sense of a holiday excursion. The men, women, and children loading the vehicles moved with a mechanical, somber efficiency. They had sold their homes, liquidated their bank accounts, and severed ties with skeptical relatives. They were shedding the skin of the secular world, preparing to enter what Blackwood called the chrysalis. Watching from the porch of the county sheriff's office was Orson Kyle, a lawman whose face carried the weathered texture of the landscape he protected. Kyle had been keeping a loose eye on Blackwood for months. There had been no laws broken, strictly speaking. Freedom of religion was a shield Blackwood wielded with expert precision, but Kyle's instinct, honed by 30 years of policing rural desolation, twitched with unease. He watched as Thaddeus Vance, Blackwood's imposing enforcer and right-hand man, checked the tie-downs on a truck bed. Vance was a brute of a man, a former oil rig worker with a history of assault that had been conveniently washed away by his newfound piety. The way Vance looked at the townspeople, with a mixture of pity and predatory disdain, sent a cold spike through the oppressive heat. Among the followers was Coraline Mears, a young schoolteacher whose life had been unraveling since the tragic death of her husband a year prior. Blackwood had preyed upon her grief, offering her not just solace, but a reason for her suffering. In the passenger seat of her beige sedan, she stared straight ahead, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. To the onlookers, she looked like a woman found, but to Sheriff Cale, she looked like a woman lost. He tipped his hat as the convoy began to roll, the engines coughing smoke into the stagnant air. He didn't know then that he was watching a funeral procession for the living. The destination was a derelict homestead 40 miles deep into the scrubland, an area locally known as Dead Man's Gulch. It was a place where the geography conspired to hide secrets. The land dipped suddenly, swallowing sound and sight, surrounded by twisted cottonwood trees that grew thick along a dried-up creek bed. The isolation was absolute. There were no phone lines, no mail routes, and the nearest paved road was an hour's drive over treacherous, rutted dirt tracks. As the convoy arrived, the dust settling around them like a suffocating blanket, Blackwood stood at the gate of the property. He did not help unload. He simply watched, his silhouette stark against the blinding sun, counting his flock as they passed into the enclosure. The first order of business was not shelter but containment. Under Thaddeus Vance's barking orders, the men began reinforcing the perimeter. The existing cattle fencing was insufficient for Blackwood's paranoia. They erected sheets of corrugated metal and strung barbed wire, turning the farmstead inward. It was a physical manifestation of their psychological state. The world outside was the enemy, a place of sin and impending nuclear fire, while the inside was the only sanctuary. However, sanctuary quickly began to look like incarceration. By sunset, the single gate was secured with a heavy chain and a padlock, the key to which vanished into Blackwood's pocket. Inside the compound, the atmosphere shifted from the frenetic energy of travel to a hushed reverence. The followers gathered in the main barn, a cavernous, drafty structure that smelled of old hay and dry rot. This building would become the epicenter of their new life, and eventually their tomb. Blackwood took the makeshift pulpit, lit by the flickering glow of kerosene lamps, and delivered his inaugural sermon of the new era. He spoke of the purity of deprivation, telling them that their hunger would feed their spirits, and their isolation would amplify the voice of God. He demanded that all remaining currency, identification, and car keys be placed in a communal basket at his feet. It was the final severing of the tether. As Coraline Mears dropped her keys into the basket, she felt a momentary tremor of panic, a biological alarm ringing in the back of her lizard brain. She looked around at the faces of her new family, faces illuminated by the dancing shadows of the flames. They looked back with eyes wide with adoration and fear. There was Brogan Holloway, a mechanic who had brought his 3 children. There was Widow Gastrell, clutching her Bible like a weapon. They were all trapped now, though they called it freedom. Outside, the wind began to howl across the plains, rattling the metal sheets of the perimeter fence. Miles away, Sheriff Orson Cale sat in his office staring at a map of the county, his finger tracing the route to Dead Man's Gulch, unable to shake the feeling that he had just let a wolf lock itself in the pen with the sheep. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the Oklahoma Panhandle into darkness, and the first night of the sanctified shepherd's flock began in silence, save for the sound of the padlock clicking shut. The transformation of Dead Man's Gulch from a refuge into a prison camp was not instantaneous. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of human dignity, masked as spiritual discipline. By the second week of July, the Oklahoma sun had turned the compound into a kiln, baking the earth until it was hard as iron. Gideon Blackwood capitalized on the brutal climate, weaving the unbearable heat into his theology. He preached that sweat was the physical manifestation of sin leaving the body, and therefore relief was an affront to God. The days began at 4 in the morning, long before the sun crested the horizon, with the ringing of a heavy iron bell that Thaddeus Vance struck with sadistic rhythmic precision. Sleep was labeled a luxury of the damned, and the followers were permitted only 5 hours of rest on thin mats spread across the concrete floor of the barn. Labor became the primary instrument of control. Blackwood ordered the construction of a meaningless structure in the center of the property, a tower of stone and timber that served no practical purpose. He called it the Spire of Ascension, claiming it needed to be tall enough to catch the first light of the apocalypse. Men like Brogan Holloway, whose hands were once skilled at fixing engines, were now reduced to hauling jagged river rocks from the dry creek bed until their fingers bled and their backs spasmed. The women, including Coraline Mears, were tasked with purifying the land, which amounted to scouring the dirt on their hands and knees for non-existent weeds and debris, a task designed solely to induce exhaustion and break the spirit. Food was the first tether to reality to be severed. The hearty supplies brought from Turpin were hoarded in a locked shed guarded by Vance. Instead of meals, the flock was given a watery gruel twice a day, a tasteless mixture of boiled oats and grey water that barely sustained life. The psychological dismantling of the group took place during the nightly gatherings known as the Reckoning. These sessions were mandatory and terrifying. Under the flickering light of kerosene lanterns, Blackwood would pace the stage, his voice dropping to a hypnotic whisper. He introduced the concept of transparent thought, the idea that secrets were a cancer. One by one, he would call a follower to the front and demand they confess their deepest shames. It began with minor infractions, envy, laziness, doubt, but under Blackwood's piercing gaze and the collective pressure of the group, the confessions grew frantic and fabricated. People began to invent sins just to satisfy his hunger for control. When Widow Gastrell, a frail woman in her 60s, stumbled over her words, Vance humiliated her, forcing her to kneel on uncooked rice for an hour, while the others watched in silence. This was the turning point, the moment the group learned that empathy for the victim was treason against the leader. Outside the fences, Sheriff Orson Cale was beginning to feel the itch of suspicion turn into a rash. The town of Turpin had quieted down after the departure, but the silence was uneasy. Cale began digging into Gideon Blackwood's history, pulling favors from a contact in the state police. The telex machine in his office spat out a fragmented report that chilled him. Blackwood wasn't a theologian. His real name was Arthur Penhaligon, a drifter from Kansas who had spent 3 years in a state psychiatric facility for religious delusions with violent ideations in the mid-70s. There was no record of a seminary, no ordination, only a trail of petty fraud and a restraining order filed by a woman in Wichita who had later vanished. Kyle drove out to the perimeter of Dead Man's Gulch that Tuesday, parking his cruiser on a rise overlooking the valley. Through his binoculars, he saw the shimmering heat haze and the glint of the metal fences, but no movement. The compound looked like a graveyard. Back inside, the isolation was beginning to warp the followers' perception of reality. The heat exhaustion combined with starvation created a collective delirium. Coraline Mears found herself dissociating during her labor, losing hours of time where she simply stared at the horizon. She began to believe Blackwood's rhetoric because her starving brain could no longer process logic. The outside world felt like a dream, and the pain of her blistered hands was the only truth. Blackwood sensed this vulnerability and tightened the screws. He announced that the world of men had finally ended, that nuclear fire had consumed the cities, and they were the last living souls on Earth. Without a radio or newspaper, and with the horizon obscured by dust storms, there was no way to disprove him. The lie settled over them like a shroud. The chapter concluded with a horrifying display of dominance. One of the younger men, a teenager named Sterling Pike, who had come with his parents, was caught trying to hoard a mesmerizingly small object, a single wrinkled apple he had hidden in his boot. Vance discovered it during a routine bunk inspection. Blackwood did not yell. Instead, he gathered the flock and spoke softly about the rot within the apple, spreading to the whole barrel. He forced Sterling to dig a hole in the center of the yard, 4 feet deep under the midday sun. When the boy was finished, dehydrated and weeping, Blackwood ordered him to stand in it. They buried him up to his neck, packing the dirt tight. He was left there for 24 hours without water, his head a singular target for the insects and the sun. As night fell, Coraline lay on her mat, listening to Sterling's weak cries for his mother, who lay just a few feet away, sobbing silently into her hands, too terrified of Blackwood to save her own son. The bond of family had been obliterated. Only the bond to the shepherd remained. By the 3rd week, the sanctified shepherd's flock had entered a state of necrotic decay. The compound at Dead Man's Gulch no longer resembled a settlement. It looked like the aftermath of a siege. The spire of ascension stood half-finished, a jagged finger pointing at an indifferent sky, abandoned because the laborers no longer had the caloric energy to lift the stones. The heat wave had intensified, pushing temperatures past 105 degrees for 6 consecutive days. The water in the single well on the property was running low, pumping up mud and silt that had to be strained through cloth before it could be consumed. Dysentery began to sweep through the barracks, weakening the already skeletal followers. The stench of sickness, unwashed bodies, and overflowing latrines hung heavy in the stagnant air, but Blackwood forbade any hygiene practices, claiming the smell was the honest scent of mortality. The isolation was punctured, briefly and violently, on a Thursday afternoon. A man named Tobias Thorne, the estranged brother of one of the female followers, had driven his rusted pickup truck all the way from the Texas border. He hadn't heard from his sister in a month, and his letters had been returned unopened. Thorne was a large man, fueled by concern and a short temper. He rammed his truck against the locked gate, the metal screeching in protest, and leaned on his horn, shouting for his sister to come out. Inside the barn, the sound of the horn was like a bomb going off. The followers, conditioned to believe the outside world was a radioactive wasteland filled with demons, cowered in fear. Blackwood seized the moment, his eyes gleaming with manic opportunism. He pointed to the gate and declared Thorne a demon of the old world, sent to tempt them back into the fire. Thaddeus Vance approached the gate, flanked by 2 other men who had been elevated to the rank of guardians. They were armed not with guns yet, but with heavy shovel handles and lengths of pipe. Thorne, seeing the gaunt, hollow-eyed figures approaching, stopped shouting. He demanded to see his sister. Vance didn't speak. He simply unlocked the gate and stepped out, swinging the pipe with brutal efficiency. He struck Thorne across the knees, dropping him to the dust, and then proceeded to beat the man while the guardians smashed the windshield of his truck. It was a savage, uncoordinated assault designed to maim. From the rise in the distance, Sheriff Cale, who had been making daily patrols, saw the dust cloud and the commotion. He hit his siren, the wail cutting through the air, and floored the accelerator of his cruiser. Kyle arrived just as Vance was dragging a semi-conscious Thorne away from the truck. The sheriff drew his service revolver, leveling it at Vance through the chain-link fence. The standoff was tense, the air vibrating with heat and adrenaline. Kyle ordered Vance to back down, but Vance simply smiled, his teeth stained yellow, and retreated inside the compound, locking the gate behind him. He left Thorne bleeding in the dirt. Kyle couldn't breach the perimeter without a warrant or immediate probable cause of a felony in progress that he could articulate to a judge who was already hesitant to interfere with religious groups. He radioed for an ambulance for Thorne and stood at the fence screaming for Blackwood. Gideon appeared on the porch of the farmhouse, holding a Bible. He didn't shout back. He simply turned his back on the law, signaling to his followers that the sheriff was powerless against God's elect. This incident, rather than saving them, sealed their fate. That evening, Blackwood gathered the trembling flock. He told them that the attack by Thorne and the arrival of the sheriff proved that the end of days had entered its final phase. The government, he claimed, was coming to kill them for their purity. Paranoia metastasized into absolute terror. To ensure their safety, Blackwood ordered the windows of the barn boarded up from the inside. He cut the main power line to the property, plunging the compound into permanent darkness, save for the few candles he controlled. He declared that sight was a distraction. From now on they would live in the gloom, waiting for his signal. Inside the boarded-up barn, the temperature rose to suffocating levels. Coraline Mears, huddled in the corner, felt her sanity fraying. The darkness was absolute, pressing against her eyes. She could hear the shallow breathing of the others, the weeping of the children, and the muttering of the sick. In this sensory deprivation tank, Blackwood's voice became the only reality. He began to whisper about unburdening the flesh, a vague and ominous phrase that suggested the body itself was the trap. The food stopped coming entirely. Blackwood claimed he was fasting for them, taking their hunger upon himself, though he appeared energetic and manic while they withered. The chapter ends with a discovery that shattered the last remnant of hope for Coraline. Searching for a dropped locket in the dim candlelight near the back of the barn, she found a loose floorboard. Prying it up, hoping to find a cool draft of air, She instead found the stash. Hidden beneath the floor were wrappers, candy bars, canned beef, empty bottles of soda. Blackwood and Vance hadn't been fasting. They had been feasting while the flock starved. But before she could process the betrayal, a heavy hand clamped onto her shoulder. She froze, the smell of stale tobacco and sweat filling her nose. It was Thaddeus Vance. He didn't speak, he just tightened his grip, his silhouette looming over her in the flickering dark. The shepherd wasn't protecting the sheep from the wolves, he was simply fattening himself while they died. The discovery of the food hoard beneath the floorboards did not result in Coraline Mears' immediate execution, for Gideon Blackwood was a man who preferred the theatre of suffering over the mercy of a quick death. Thaddeus Vance, with hands like vice grips, did not drag her back to the main congregation. Instead, he hauled her into the suffocating darkness of the root cellar, a cramped earthen pit located beneath the farmhouse kitchen. It was a space originally designed to keep potatoes from rotting, but in the sweltering July of 1983, it was a damp, mold-infested oubliette. Vance threw her into the blackness and bolted the heavy wooden door from the outside. There was no light, no ventilation, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and ancient decay. Coraline was left alone with the knowledge of the leader's betrayal, a truth that burned hotter than the starvation, clawing at her stomach. She screamed until her throat was raw, pounding her fists against the wood, but her cries were swallowed by the floorboards above, unheard by the flock who were busy praying for their own salvation in the barn. Above ground, the psychological disintegration of the sanctified shepherd's flock accelerated. The incident with the truck and the sheriff had pushed the group into a collective hysteria. Blackwood, sensing the precariousness of his control, tightened the noose. He announced that the time of silence had begun. Speaking was now forbidden, unless it was in prayer or confession. The compound fell into a ghostly quiet, broken only by the wind rattling the corrugated metal fences and the dry coughing of the sick. The followers moved like pantomimes of the living, their eyes glazed, their skin hanging loosely on their frames. They were becoming less human, more like automatons programmed by Blackwood's voice. The heat wave showed no mercy. The mercury hovered near 110 degrees, turning the metal-roofed barn into an oven. Without adequate water, the followers began to hallucinate. They saw angels in the dust devils and demons in the shadows of the cottonwood trees. Sheriff Orson Cale, meanwhile, was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the cult and one against the bureaucracy of the state. The legal system required concrete evidence of imminent harm to authorize a raid, and Blackwood had been careful to keep his atrocities hidden behind the veil of religious freedom. Frustrated and desperate, Cale drove to the county dump, where the cult's trash had been deposited weeks prior, before they locked the gates. Digging through the refuse under the blistering sun, amidst swarms of flies, he found a discarded journal. It belonged to Sterling Pike, the boy who had been buried in the yard. The entries were erratic, written in the frantic scrawl of a terrified child. They detailed the punishments, the hunger, and Blackwood's obsession with purification by flame. The last entry, dated 2 days before the lockdown, read simply, "He says the fire doesn't hurt if you are pure. I am not pure." The journal was the smoking gun Cale needed, but getting a judge to sign a warrant based on the diary of a troubled youth would take time the people in Dead Man's Gulch did not have. Back in the root cellar, Coraline lost all concept of time. Darkness was total. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind replaying the image of the candy wrappers and the canned meat. The betrayal was absolute. The man she had looked to as a father figure, a spiritual guide who promised to reunite her with her deceased husband in the afterlife, was a fraud. This realization, rather than breaking her completely, forged a hard, cold knot of rage in her chest. She stopped screaming and started listening. She pressed her ear to the cracks in the ceiling boards. She could hear heavy footsteps pacing in the kitchen above, Blackwood and Vance. They were arguing. Vance sounded agitated, his voice a low rumble of concern about the supplies running low and the sheriff watching. Blackwood's voice was different. It was manic, high-pitched, speaking of a grand exit and the chariot of fire. Coraline realized with a jolt of ice-cold terror that Blackwood had no intention of surviving the siege. He wasn't planning a defense. he was planning a finale. On the 5th day of the time of silence, the weather turned. The relentless sun was obscured by towering, bruised thunderheads rolling in from the west. The atmospheric pressure dropped, causing headaches and joint pain among the starving followers. The sky turned a sickly shade of green, a precursor to the violent storms that often ravaged the Panhandle. Inside the barn, the sudden darkness during the day caused a panic. Blackwood seized the pulpit, his face illuminated by a lightning flash through the cracks in the boards. He declared the storm was the arrival of the 4 horsemen. He told them that the thunder was the sound of God's war drums. The flock, terrified and starving, fell to their knees, begging for deliverance. In this chaotic moment, Blackwood introduced the final phase of his theology, the shedding of the earthly husk. He told them that their bodies were the only things anchoring them to this doomed world, and that to truly ascend, they must be willing to leave them behind. The chapter concludes with a moment of horrific clarity for Sheriff Cale. He had returned to the perimeter of the compound as the storm broke, watching through his rain-slicked windshield. Lightning illuminated the yard in strobe light flashes. In one of those flashes he saw movement near the barn. 2 figures were dragging something heavy towards the unfinished spire of ascension. It looked like a bundle of rags, but then an arm flopped loose, striking the mud. It was a body. Cale grabbed his radio, screaming for backup, but the storm static drowned out his transmission. He was alone, witnessing the disposal of the first casualty, realizing that the warrant no longer mattered. The dying had already started, and the storm was providing the perfect cover for the massacre to come. He checked his revolver, opened the car door, and stepped out into the driving rain, knowing he was crossing a line from which he might not return. The storm that battered Dead Man's Gulch was violent enough to tear the shingles off the farmhouse roof, but inside the barn, a different kind of turbulence was tearing apart the sanity of the sanctified shepherd's flock. The body Sheriff Cale had seen being dragged through the mud was that of Widow Gastrell. She had collapsed during the height of the thunderclaps, her heart finally giving out under the strain of starvation and heat. Blackwood had not mourned her. Instead, he had stood over her cooling corpse and proclaimed her the first ascended, the scout who had gone ahead to prepare their mansions in paradise. Her death was not treated as a tragedy, but as a graduation. This reframing of mortality broke the last survival instinct in the group. If death was the goal, then living was the failure. The followers began to look at each other not with camaraderie, but with envy for the dead. Sheriff Orson Cale, soaked to the bone and shivering in the gale-force wind, had managed to cut a hole in the perimeter wire on the north side of the property, furthest from the farmhouse. He moved like a ghost through the tall, whipping grass, his boots sinking deep into the mud. The compound was dark save for the faint, sickly yellow glow emanating from the cracks in the barn's boarded windows. He could hear chanting rising over the sound of the wind, a low, discordant drone that sounded less like a hymn and more like a moan of collective pain. Cale crept towards the barn, his heart hammering against his ribs. He needed to see what was happening inside before he could act. He found a knot in the wood, a small peephole into hell, and pressed his eye against it. What he saw would haunt him until his dying day. The interior of the barn had been transformed into a grotesque tableau. The followers were arranged in a circle, swaying rhythmically. In the center, Gideon Blackwood stood next to a large, galvanized steel tub filled with a dark, viscous liquid. He was performing a baptism, but not with water. He was dipping a ladle into the tub and pouring the substance over the heads of his kneeling disciples. It was kerosene. The smell drifted through the cracks, overpowering the scent of rain and ozone. Cale recoiled, his breath hitching in his throat. Blackwood was anointing them for the slaughter. He wasn't just killing them, he was preparing them to burn. The followers, in their delirium, seemed unaware of the danger, or perhaps they welcomed it. They accepted the fuel like a blessing, their faces upturned, eyes wide and unseeing. Meanwhile, in the root cellar, Coraline Mears had found a weapon. In the total darkness, her fingers had brushed against a rusted gardening trowel buried in the dirt floor. It was a small, blunt instrument, but it was solid iron. She gripped it until her hand cramped. The storm outside muffled the sounds of the house, but she felt the vibrations of heavy boots on the floorboards above. Then, The bolt on the cellar door slid back with a rusty screech. Light flooded in, a blinding lantern beam that seared her eyes. Thaddeus Vance stood at the top of the stairs, a silhouette of malice. He held a length of rope and a rag. He had come to retrieve her for the ceremony. He descended the stairs, blocking the only exit, his massive frame filling the narrow passage. He didn't see the trowel hidden behind her back. He saw only a broken woman cowering in the dirt. It was a fatal underestimation. As Vance reached for her, Coraline lunged. She didn't aim for his head or his chest. She drove the rusted tip of the trowel into his shin, scraping it down the bone with all the force of her desperation. Vance roared in pain and surprise, his leg buckling. He fell forward, crashing into the dirt floor of the cellar. The lantern shattered, extinguishing the light and plunging them back into darkness. But this time, the darkness was Coraline's ally. She scrambled over his thrashing body, kicking him in the face as he tried to grab her ankle. She clawed her way up the wooden stairs, lungs burning, and burst into the kitchen of the farmhouse. The air was cool and smelled of rain. She didn't stop. She ran out the back door into the raging storm, the mud sucking at her bare feet, heading blindly toward the only shelter she knew, the barn. She didn't know yet that she was running from one prison into a crematorium. Kyle, still peering through the knot in the barn wall, saw the back doors of the barn burst open. Coraline stumbled in, drenched and covered in mud, screaming that Vance was down, screaming that it was all a lie. The chanting stopped. The followers turned to look at her, their faces glistening with kerosene. Blackwood froze, the ladle hovering in mid-air. For a second the spell wavered. The reality of a frantic, terrified woman clashed with the hypnotic trance. But Blackwood was a master of improvisation. He pointed a long, bony finger at Coraline and shrieked that she was the whore of Babylon, sent by the storm to test their resolve. He ordered the men, husbands, fathers, brothers, to seize her. The men, their minds warped by starvation and fumes, obeyed. They tackled Coraline, dragging her toward the center of the circle, toward the tub of fuel. Kyle knew he was out of time. He couldn't wait for backup. He couldn't wait for a tactical advantage. He drew his revolver and kicked the side door of the barn. It held. He kicked again, the wood splintering but not breaking. Inside, the commotion grew louder. Kyle stepped back and fired 2 shots into the lock mechanism. The sound was deafening, a thunderclap that originated from the earth. He shoulder-charged the door and it gave way, swinging open into the kerosene-scented nightmare. He stepped inside, gun raised, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "Police!" he roared, his voice cracking with intensity. "Step away from her!" The tableau froze. 19 pairs of eyes turned to him. Blackwood stared at the gun, then at Kyle, and a smile of terrifying beatitude spread across his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver Zippo lighter. "You are too late, Sheriff," Blackwood whispered, his voice cutting through the silence. "The fire has already been lit in our hearts." He flicked the lighter open. The flame danced, small and yellow, the only bright thing in a world of shadows. The atmosphere inside the barn at Dead Man's Gulch had transcended physical reality. It was a pressurized chamber of volatile fumes and even more volatile belief. When Sheriff Orson Kyle burst through the door, weapon drawn, the scene that greeted him was a tableau of imminent self-destruction. The air was so thick with the stench of kerosene that it tasted chemical on the tongue, stinging the eyes and coating the lungs with every breath. In the center of the room, Gideon Blackwood stood like a conductor of the damned, the small flame of his Zippo lighter dancing dangerously close to the vapors rising from his soaked congregation. Kyle froze. His training screamed at him to fire, to neutralize the threat, but the tactical nightmare of the situation paralyzed his trigger finger. A single muzzle flash in this saturated environment could be the spark that ignited the entire building, turning a rescue mission into an immediate mass execution. Blackwood, possessing a terrifying emotional intelligence, recognized the sheriff's hesitation instantly. He didn't drop the lighter. He raised it higher, a beacon of defiance, challenging the lawman to become the agent of their apocalypse. The standoff stretched into an agonizing silence, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain on the tin roof and the ragged breathing of the 19 followers. They were kneeling in the dirt, their clothes heavy with fuel, their eyes darting between the gun and the flame. They were trapped in a psychological limbo, caught between the instinct to survive and the indoctrination that told them death was the only freedom. Coraline Mears, pinned to the ground by two skeletal men, looked at Cale with a desperation that transcended language. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the realization that he had no good options. Cale lowered his aim slightly, shifting from center mass to Blackwood's shoulder, trying to find a trajectory that wouldn't spark a conflagration. He shouted commands, his voice raw, ordering Blackwood to extinguish the flame, but his words were absorbed by the heavy, suffocating silence of the cult. To them, he was not a rescuer, he was the intrusion of the profane world, a demon sent to interrupt their glory. The balance of power shifted violently from the shadows. Thaddeus Vance, limping and bloody from the wound Coraline had inflicted in the cellar, had not stayed down. Fueled by adrenaline and a berserker's rage, he had crawled from the farmhouse through the mud, entering the barn through the rear loading bay, while Cale's attention was fixed on Blackwood. Cale never saw the blow coming. Vance wielded a heavy length of oak fencing like a club, striking the sheriff across the back of the head with crushing force. The world went white, then black, for Orson Cale. He crumpled to the dirt, his revolver flying from his hand and skittering across the floor, coming to rest near the boots of Brogan Holloway. For a moment, Holloway stared at the weapon, a tool of deliverance lying right there, but his spirit was so broken, his mind so warped by hunger and fear, that he simply kicked it away deeper into the shadows. With the demon incapacitated, the fervor in the room spiked. Blackwood snapped the lighter shut, extinguishing the immediate threat only to replace it with a prolonged ritualistic torture. He ordered Vance, who was breathing heavily and dripping blood onto the floor, to bind the sheriff to the central support beam of the barn. They used the same heavy rope intended for the livestock. Cale, groggy and concussed, was lashed upright, forced to be a witness to the horror he had failed to prevent. Blackwood paced in front of him, addressing the flock with renewed vigor. He gestured to the bleeding lawman and wove a narrative of divine validation. He claimed that Cale's arrival was the final sign, the breaking of the seventh seal. The world outside was not just indifferent, it was actively hunting them. There was no going back now. The bridges had been burned, and soon their bodies would follow. Coraline was dragged to the front of the room and tied next to Cale, though facing the congregation. Blackwood wanted her to see the faces of the people she had betrayed. The dynamic in the barn shifted from a religious ceremony to a tribunal. Blackwood accused Coraline and Cale of conspiring with the dark forces to keep the flock grounded in their rotting flesh suits. The followers, starved and hallucinating from the fumes, began to sway and moan, a low keening sound that vibrated in the chest. They were disassociating, their minds retreating from the terror of the reality into the safety of the delusion. Blackwood moved among them, whispering into their ears, touching their foreheads with his kerosene-soaked hands, sealing their fate. He told them that the pain of the fire would be fleeting, a mere pinch before the eternal embrace of the cosmos. He was selling them suicide as a luxury vacation. The chapter closes with the final preparations for the Great Ascension. Vance, despite his injury, worked with a manic efficiency, piling dry hay and broken furniture around the perimeter of the room, creating a ring of kindling that would ensure the fire burned inward, trapping everyone in the center. He boarded up the door Cale had kicked in, hammering long nails into the wood, sealing the tomb. The sound of the hammer strikes echoed like gunshots. Cale, regaining his senses, strained against the ropes, pleading with the followers, calling them by name, names he had learned from their missing persons reports. "Brogan, look at your children. Mrs. Gable, think of your sister." But his words fell on deaf ears. They were already gone, their eyes fixed on Blackwood, who stood at the altar, the Zippo lighter once again in his hand, ready to usher in the end of their world. The barn at Dead Man's Gulch was no longer a structure of wood and iron. It was a loaded weapon, pointed at the heart of 19 souls. The air was so saturated with hydrocarbons that the mere act of breathing caused dizziness. Sheriff Orson Cale, bound tightly to the rough-hewn cedar post, felt the warm trickle of blood down his neck from the blow he had sustained. His vision swam, but the horror before him was sharply focused. Beside him, Coraline Mears had stopped fighting. She hung limp in her restraints, her energy spent, her eyes wide and fixed on the galvanized tub of kerosene that sat like a dark baptismal font in the center of the room. The silence that had descended upon the group was unnatural. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the hush of a predator before the strike. The storm outside had intensified, thunder shaking the ground, effectively masking any screams that might soon emanate from within the locked enclosure. Gideon Blackwood began his final sermon, but this time he did not shout. He spoke in a soft, intimate register that forced the followers to lean in, drawing them physically closer to their doom. He spoke of the purity of ash, of the fire as a cleansing agent that would scrub the sin of existence from their bones. He walked the circle of his flock, pouring the remaining contents of the kerosene tub onto the dirt floor, creating a connecting fuse that linked every person, every pile of hay, and every exit. The liquid soaked into the dry earth, turning the ground black. He was painting a masterpiece of destruction. As he moved, he caught the eye of Brogan Holloway's youngest daughter, a 7-year-old girl named Ilara. She was clutching a ragged doll, her face smeared with grime. For a fleeting second, a flicker of hesitation crossed Blackwood's face, not of guilt but of aesthetic critique, as if wondering if her terror would mar the perfection of the moment. He poured a line of fuel across the toes of her small sneakers and moved on. Orson Cale, realizing that appeals to logic were useless, switched tactics. He tried to trigger the survival instinct of the alpha male, Thaddeus Vance. "He's going to burn you too, Vance," Kyle rasped, his voice hoarse. "You think you're the high priest? You're just the kindling he saved for last. Look at the door, he's the only one with the key." Vance, who was dousing the far wall with a canister of gasoline found in the shed, paused. He looked at the heavy padlock on the main chain. He looked at Blackwood, who was lost in his trance. A seed of doubt, watered by Cale's words, began to germinate in the brute's mind. Vance had always assumed he would walk out of the fire, the sole witness to testify to the glory. But looking at the barricades he had helped erect, the mathematical certainty of the trap became clear. There was no exit for him either. The tension in the room snapped when one of the followers, a young man named Silas who had been weeping silently, stood up. He didn't attack. He simply began to panic. The fumes had triggered a primal claustrophobia. He clawed at his throat, gasping for air, and bolted toward the boarded-up window. I can't breathe," he screamed, tearing at the wood with his fingernails. The sudden movement shattered the hypnotic spell Blackwood had cast. The other followers jolted, looking around as if waking from a dream. The reality of the soaked clothes and the locked doors crashed down on them. Panic, sharp and contagious, began to spread. Blackwood saw his control fracturing. He knew he couldn't talk them back down. The time for words had ended. "Behold the light!" Blackwood shrieked, his voice cracking into a falsetto. He didn't wait for the ceremony to conclude. He didn't wait for the prayer. He threw the Zippo lighter into the center of the room. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The fumes ignited with a whoosh that sounded like a jet engine engaging. A wall of blue and orange flame erupted from the floor, separating the flock from the center of the room. The heat was immediate and blistering. The screams began, not the screams of religious ecstasy, but the guttural, animalistic shrieks of people realizing they were burning. The fire followed the trails of kerosene Blackwood had poured, racing toward the hay bales and the walls. The barn was transforming into a blast furnace. Vance, seeing the fire roar to life, abandoned his loyalty. He dropped the canister and lunged for the side door, the one Cale had damaged. He slammed his shoulder into it, screaming in incoherent rage, but the nails he had driven in earlier held fast. The irony was absolute. He was trapped by his own handiwork. Cale struggled against his ropes, the heat singing the hair on his arms. The fire was inches from his feet. Beside him, Coraline was coughing, choking on the thick black smoke that began to pool in the rafters and descend like a shroud. The scene was pure chaos, figures running through flames, pounding on walls, the roar of the fire drowning out the storm outside. Blackwood stood in the center of the inferno, untouched for the moment by the flames circling him. He looked euphoric, his arms raised to the burning roof, laughing as the world around him turned to ash. But then, through the smoke and the fire, a figure emerged. It was Brogan Holloway. His clothes were smoking, his skin blistered, but he was driven by the sight of his daughter screaming in the corner. He didn't run for the door. He ran for Blackwood. With a roar of paternal fury that defied the physics of his starving body, Holloway tackled the prophet into the heart of the fire. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs into the burning kerosene pool. The shepherd and the sheep were now consuming each other. Cale felt the heat weaken the fibers of the rope binding his hands. He pulled until his wrists bled, feeling the hemp give way. He had seconds, maybe less, before the oxygen was gone and the barn became a tomb for them all. The interior of the barn at Dead Man's Gulch had ceased to be a structure of human design. It had devolved into a chaotic, superheated organism that consumed everything in its path. The fire, fed by the gallons of kerosene Gideon Blackwood had meticulously distributed, did not behave like a natural element. It moved with a predatory intelligence, racing up the dry timber walls and swirling across the floorboards in liquid waves of blue and orange. The temperature spiked to over 1,000 degrees in seconds, a heat so intense that it instantly seared the lungs of anyone who dared to inhale deeply. The screams that had initially pierced the air were quickly silenced, not by mercy, but by the rapid consumption of oxygen. The roar of the conflagration became the only sound in the universe, a deafening, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in the marrow of Sheriff Orson Cale's bones as he fought against the fraying hemp ropes that bound him to the central post. Cale's wrists were slick with blood and sweat, the friction of his struggle tearing the skin raw, but the pain was distant, filtered through a massive surge of adrenaline. The heat wave that washed over him singed his eyebrows and curled the leather of his boots. He watched in horrific slow motion as the sanctified shepherd's flock disintegrated into madness. The unity of the cult, so carefully cultivated by Blackwood through months of starvation and indoctrination, evaporated the moment the flesh began to burn. The followers were no longer disciples, they were trapped animals. Thaddeus Vance, the brute who had enforced the lockdown, was now a victim of his own efficiency. He threw his massive bulk against the side door again and again, his shoulder shattering against the reinforced wood, but the nails he had driven in earlier held fast. He turned, his face a mask of soot and terror, only to be engulfed by a falling rafter wrapped in flame. He fell screaming, his body becoming just another log on the pyre. In the center of the inferno, a grim struggle played out that looked like a scene from Dante's Deepest Circle. Brogan Holloway, the mechanic who had brought his children to this hell, had pinned Gideon Blackwood to the ground in the middle of the kerosene pool. Blackwood, who had expected a majestic, painless ascension, was instead thrashing in the boiling mud, his suit melting onto his skin. He clawed at Holloway's face, gouging eyes and tearing flesh, desperate to escape the consequences of his own prophecy. But Holloway, fueled by the sight of his daughter's burning sneakers, held on with the rigor mortis of the living dead. He wasn't trying to survive, he was ensuring that the shepherd did not leave the slaughterhouse. The two men rolled through the fire, an indistinguishable tangle of limbs and shadows, until the flames swallowed them both, silencing Blackwood's final hypocritical plea for mercy. Cale felt the rope snap. The fibers, weakened by the heat and his violent thrashing, finally gave way. He fell forward onto his hands and knees, the floorboards scorching his palms. The air at ground level was slightly cooler, though thick with toxic black smoke that tasted of plastic and roasted meat. He scrambled toward the post where Coraline Mears was tied. She was slumped forward, unconscious from the smoke, her hair beginning to smolder. Cale pulled a pocket knife from his boot, a backup weapon Vance hadn't found during the initial search, and sawed frantically at her bindings. The heat was unbearable now. The skin on Kyle's neck was blistering, and his vision was tunneling into a grey haze. He freed her, catching her dead weight as she fell. He looked around for the others, for the children, but the barn was a wall of fire. The pews, the hay bales, the bodies, everything was part of the blaze. There was no way to reach Ilara Holloway or the others. They were gone, hidden behind a curtain of thermal violence. Cale dragged Coraline across the floor, staying low, crawling toward a section of the wall where the wood looked rotted near the foundation. The main doors were impassable, blocked by the fire and the crush of bodies. The side door was sealed. The only way out was through the structure itself. He used the heel of his boot, kicking at the weakened planks with every ounce of strength he had left. The wood splintered, revealing a sliver of the stormy night outside. The rush of fresh, oxygen-rich air that entered the barn acted like a bellows, feeding the fire and causing a backdraft that exploded outward. Cale shielded Coraline's body with his own, as the fireball rolled over them, singing his uniform and searing his back. With a primal roar, he kicked again, shattering the rotted siding. He shoved Coraline through the jagged opening, into the mud and the rain, and threw himself after her, tumbling out of the furnace and into the wet, cold grasp of the storm. They landed in the muck, gasping for air, the rain hitting their superheated skin like acid. Kyle didn't stop. He grabbed Coraline by the collar of her shirt and dragged her further away, scrambling on hands and knees through the sludge. Behind them, the barn groaned. The structural integrity of the building, compromised by the intense heat, failed catastrophically. The roof, heavy with rain-soaked shingles, collapsed inward with a sound that shook the earth. It was a massive, crushing implosion that sent a geyser of sparks and embers shooting hundreds of feet into the night sky, defying the rain. The screaming stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the crackle of the burning ruin and the distant rumble of thunder. Kyle collapsed in the mud, staring at the bonfire that was now the tomb of 19 people. He checked for Coraline's pulse. It was faint, thready, but there. She was alive. They were the only ones. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had saved a life, but he had lost a war. The dawn that broke over the Oklahoma Panhandle the following morning was grey and lifeless, the sun struggling to pierce the heavy veil of clouds that lingered after the storm. The rain had ceased, leaving the landscape of Dead Man's Gulch washed in a grim, monochromatic palette of mud and charcoal. The air was still thick with the cloying, sweet, sick stench of burnt biological matter, a smell that hung low in the valley and refused to dissipate. It was a scent that Sheriff Orson Cale knew would never wash out of his uniform, nor his memory. He sat on the tailgate of a paramedic unit, a foil blanket wrapped around his shoulders, watching the steam rise from the blackened crater where the barn had stood. His hands were heavily bandaged, treated for second-degree burns, and his face was a map of soot and exhaustion. He looked like a statue carved from the debris of the disaster he had survived. The isolation of the compound had been shattered. The narrow dirt road leading to the property was now choked with vehicles. State police cruisers with their lights flashing silently, an oversized fire truck from the county seat that had arrived too late to do anything but wet down the ashes, and the black vans of the coroner's office. The perimeter tape, bright yellow and snapping in the wind, seemed like a pathetic attempt to impose order on a scene of absolute chaos. Men in white hazmat suits moved slowly through the smoking ruins, sifting through the debris with rakes and shovels, looking for bone fragments and teeth, the only durable remnants of the sanctified shepherd's flock. They moved with a reverent quietness, the horror of the task suppressing the usual dark humor of first responders. Coraline Mears had been airlifted to a burn unit in Oklahoma City hours ago, her condition critical but stable. She was the sole witness, the only voice left to speak for the 19 souls who had perished in the Great Ascension. Cale remained, refusing medical evacuation until the site was secured. He needed to see the end of it. He needed to verify the monster was dead. The state police captain, a man named Henderson with eyes that had seen too much highway tragedy, approached Kyle. He held a plastic evidence bag containing a partially melted object. It was the Zippo lighter. Henderson didn't speak. He just nodded toward the center of the burn pattern. They had found the flashpoint. The excavation of the barn's epicenter revealed a chilling architectural secret that reshaped the narrative of the massacre. As the forensics team cleared away the layers of carbonized timber and tin roofing, they discovered something that had been hidden beneath the heavy oak pulpit where Gideon Blackwood had preached. It was a trapdoor, lined with steel and sealed with a heavy bolt. Unlike the rest of the barn, the wood here was not fully consumed, protected by the density of the pulpit. When the troopers pried it open, they didn't find a root cellar or a storage space. They found a tunnel. It was a narrow, shored-up passage that ran about 50 yards underground. exiting into the dry creek bed well beyond the perimeter fence. The tunnel was stocked with supplies: fresh water, canned food, gold coins, and a set of car keys for a vehicle that was later found hidden under a camouflage tarp in the brush. The implication hit Cale with the force of a sledgehammer. Gideon Blackwood had never intended to ascend. The chrysalis, the purification by fire, the suicide pact, it was all a theater designed to eliminate the witnesses to his fraud while he slipped away into the night to start again elsewhere. The kerosene trail he had poured had been designed to create a wall of fire between him and his flock, giving him the cover of chaos to open the trapdoor and vanish. But he hadn't accounted for the human variable. He hadn't accounted for Brogan Holloway. Near the trapdoor, the coroner's team found two bodies fused together in a gruesome embrace of carbon. The forensics indicated that one figure had been on top of the other, pinning him down. The one on the bottom, identifiable by the remnants of a metal belt buckle, was Blackwood. The one on top was Holloway. The mechanic had not only tackled the prophet, he had held him directly over the trapdoor, blocking the escape route with his own burning body. Holloway had realized the betrayal in those final seconds. He saw the escape hatch and understood that the shepherd was abandoning the sheep to the wolves of the fire. In his final act of fatherhood, unable to save his children, he had ensured that the murderer died with them. It was a sacrifice of biblical proportions, a justice forged in absolute agony. By noon, the media had descended. News helicopters buzzed overhead like vultures, their cameras zooming in on the body bags being lined up on the muddy grass. Reporters from national networks stood at the police line, broadcasting the story of the Oklahoma Revival Massacre to a horrified nation. They spoke of brainwashing, of a cult of death, of the charismatic leader who led his people into the abyss. But they didn't know the truth about the tunnel yet. They didn't know that the massacre wasn't a tragedy of faith, but a botched crime scene cleanup. Kyle watched the circus form, feeling a deep, cold hollowness in his chest. He stood up, his joints popping, and walked toward his cruiser. The door was still open, the radio squawking static. He looked back one last time at the smoking scar on the land. The physical fire was out, but Cale knew that for him, and for the town of Turpin, the burning would never truly stop. The ghosts of Dead Man's Gulch had already begun to settle into the soil, waiting to haunt the history of the plains forever. The fires of Dead Man's Gulch were extinguished in hours, but the cooling of the tragedy took decades. In the weeks following the massacre, the Oklahoma Panhandle became the focal point of a national morbid curiosity. The identification of the bodies was a gruesome, painstaking process that required dental records and forensic anthropology, as the fire had stripped away nearly all identifying features. The funeral for the victims was held in a high school gymnasium in Turpin, the only venue large enough to hold the grieving families and the swarm of press. 19 caskets, most of them closed and light, sat in rows under the basketball hoops. Sheriff Orson Cale stood in the back, dressed in his dress uniform, his burned hands gloved in white cotton. He did not speak to the reporters who thrust microphones in his face. He felt like a ghost haunting the ceremony of the people he had failed to save. The investigation that followed peeled back the layers of Gideon Blackwood's operation, revealing a banality that was almost more terrifying than his theology. The sanctified shepherd's flock was not a divine movement. It was a pyramid scheme of trauma. Bank records showed that Blackwood had transferred nearly $250,000 of his followers' liquidated assets into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The tunnel beneath the pulpit, the getaway car, the hidden gold, it all painted the picture of a con man who had used the apocalypse as a retirement plan. When this truth was released to the public, it stripped Blackwood of his posthumous power. He wasn't a dark messiah who believed too much. He was a parasite who believed in nothing. This revelation was a final, cruel twist of the knife for the surviving families. Their loved ones hadn't died for a cause, however twisted. They had died for a lie. Coraline Mears spent 6 months in the burn unit. Her recovery was a brutal gauntlet of skin grafts, physical therapy, and psychological reconstruction. She emerged from the hospital permanently scarred, the skin on her arms and neck a map of the fire she had survived. But the fire had burned away her timidity. She became the primary witness in the posthumous trial of the cult's leadership, and the state's inquiry into the failure of law enforcement to intervene sooner. She testified with a cold, hard clarity that silenced the courtroom. She spoke of the starvation, the manipulation, and the final moments in the barn. She told the world about Brogan Holloway's sacrifice, ensuring that the mechanic was remembered not as a victim, but as the man who stopped a monster. Coraline never remarried, never returned to teaching. She moved to a small cabin in Colorado, seeking the cold, far away from the heat of the plains, living a quiet life as the keeper of the memory. Orson Cale retired 2 months after the massacre. The image of the burning barn and the sound of the screams were intruders that lived in his head, refusing to be evicted. He spent his remaining years sitting on his porch, staring at the horizon, trying to reconcile the limits of the law with the vastness of human evil. He died in 1994 of a heart attack, alone. In his desk drawer, they found the scorched Zippo lighter, which he had pocketed from the evidence room before leaving the force. It was a token of his penance, a reminder of the thin line between a shepherd and a butcher. The site of the tragedy, Dead Man's Gulch, was never redeveloped. The land was considered cursed by the locals. The ruins of the farmhouse were eventually bulldozed and the cellar filled in, but the scorch mark where the barn had stood remained visible for years, a stubborn patch of black earth where the grass refused to grow. Teenagers would sometimes drive out there on Halloween, daring each other to walk across the devil's dance floor, but they rarely stayed long. The silence of the place was heavy, oppressive. It was said that on hot summer nights, when the wind blew through the cottonwoods, you could hear the faint sound of singing, cut short by the roar of a fire that wasn't there. The story of the Oklahoma Revival Massacre faded from the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, but it left a permanent scar on the American psyche. It became a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of the human soul and the terrifying power of isolation. It taught a generation that the most dangerous predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like saviors offering a way out of the dark. But as Coraline Mears knew, and as the ghosts of the 19 testified in the silence of the gulch, the only thing waiting in the dark was the fire. The shepherd had not led them to paradise, he had led them to the slaughter, and in the end, the only thing that ascended from that barn was smoke. The tragedy of the sanctified shepherd's flock serves as a harrowing reminder of the fragility of the human mind when pressed by fear and the desperate need for belonging. What happened in that Oklahoma barn in 1983 was not just a crime. It was a catastrophic failure of the safeguards we assume protect us from our own darkest impulses. Gideon Blackwood was a mirror reflecting the anxieties of his time, twisting the legitimate fears of his followers into a weapon used against them. The horror lies not just in the fire, but in the trust that was betrayed before the first match was struck. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about how easily we can be led, and how high the price of salvation can truly be. If this story chilled you to the bone, or if you believe it's important to remember these dark chapters of history so they are never repeated, please consider subscribing to the channel. Click the notification bell so you never miss a documentary. I would love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from and what part of this story unsettled you the most. Your engagement helps us keep these stories alive.